June 6, 1944. Before dawn breaks over the English Channel, thousands of young men crouch in landing crafts, their hands trembling. Not from the cold Atlantic spray, but from the weight of what lies ahead. Among them is a 19-year-old private from Iowa who has never seen combat, clutching a photograph of his mother. In a few hours, he will storm a beach codenamed Omaha. In a few hours, everything will change. But this moment, this collision of fate and strategy, began years before Issou, in rooms far from the battlefield, where two men would decide the future of the world. By 1944, Nazi forces had transformed Europe into a fortress. From the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, Hitler's Wehrmacht controlled a continent. Britain stood alone in the west, bloodied but unbroken, while in the east, Soviet forces were grinding German divisions into dust at an unspeakable cost. The question haunting Allied leadership was brutally simple. How do you pierce the armor of Fortress Europe? Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt understood that time itself had become a weapon, and it was pointed at them. Stalin demanded a second front to relieve pressure on the Eastern theater. The longer the Allies waited, the more concrete and steel the Germans poured into their Atlantic wall. Delay meant death, not just for soldiers, but for millions trapped under Nazi occupation. The meetings between Churchill and Roosevelt were marathons of strategic chess. Churchill, scarred by the catastrophic failures of World War I, advocated caution. He remembered the beaches of Gallipoli, where British troops had been slaughtered trying to force defended coastlines. Roosevelt, pragmatic and determined, knew that American public opinion demanded action. The alliance itself hung in the balance. Trust between the superpowers required shared sacrifice. They settled on a date, early summer 1944. But setting a date was the easy part. The ghost of Dieppe haunted every planning session. In August 1942, Allied forces had attempted a raid on the French port of Dieppe. It was supposed to be a test of German defenses, a reconnaissance in force. Instead, it became a massacre. Of the nearly 5,000 Canadian troops who landed, more than half became casualties within hours. The Germans, entrenched in fortified positions overlooking the beaches, had turned the harbor into a killing ground. The lesson was written in blood. Never attack where the enemy expects you. Never assault a fortified port directly. Any invasion would require surprise, deception, and a landing site the Germans considered impossible. But here's what kept military planners awake at night, the psychological burden of their decision. Every day of planning was another day of occupation. Every adjustment to the strategy meant more families torn apart, more resistance fighters captured and executed, more trains rolling toward death camps. The officers knew that when D-Day finally came, thousands of young men would die in the first minutes. They would order these deaths. They would sign the papers that sent boys into machine gun fire. General Eisenhower, chosen to command the invasion, carried this weight visibly. He drafted a statement taking full responsibility for failure, tucking it into his pocket on the eve of invasion. He understood what history often forgets. The planners of D-Day were not distant strategists pushing pieces on a map. They were men sending other men's sons to die, gambling that enough would survive to liberate a continent. The path to invasion was paved with impossible choices and haunted by the faces of those who wouldn't return. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the machinery of the largest amphibious assault in history began to move. But across the Channel, the Germans were building something too, a wall of concrete and steel they believed was impenetrable. Could the Allies break through? Or would the beaches of Normandy become another Dieppe, another graveyard of failed ambition? Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood on a windswept beach in Normandy, staring at the grey horizon where sea met sky. It was early 1944, and he had been tasked with the impossible, making Hitler's Atlantic wall truly impregnable. As waves crashed against crude obstacles half buried in sand, Rommel turned to his aide and said something that would haunt German strategy. The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We'll have only one chance to throw them back, and that's in the first 24 hours. He was right. But being right wasn't enough. The Atlantic wall stretched over 1,600 miles of coastline, from Norway to the Spanish border. Hitler had proclaimed it an impenetrable fortress. Millions of tons of concrete poured into bunkers, gun emplacements, and observation posts. From the air, it looked formidable. Propaganda films showed rows of artillery, minefields dense enough to shred entire battalions, and beaches bristling with steel obstacles designed to tear the hulls from landing craft. But Rommel saw the truth. It was a facade. The defences were concentrated at major ports, exactly where the Allies would never attack after Dieppe. Long stretches of coastline remained vulnerable, protected by undermanned divisions and incomplete fortifications. The wall was a psychological weapon more than a physical one, designed to deter an invasion that both sides knew was inevitable. The German High Command was fracturing under the weight of strategic disagreement. Rommel believed the invasion had to be stopped on the beaches themselves. Station the panzer divisions near the coast, he argued. Strike while the Allies are most vulnerable, wet, disorganized, pinned against the sea. Every hour the enemy spends consolidating a beachhead is an hour lost forever. Field Marshal von Rundstedt disagreed vehemently. Keep the armor inland, he insisted. Let them land, let them commit, then crush them with a concentrated counterattack once we know where the main invasion is. The coast is too long to defend everywhere. Hitler, paranoid and increasingly detached from military reality, couldn't choose. So he chose both, which meant choosing neither. Panzer divisions were scattered across France, too far from the coast to repel an immediate invasion, too dispersed inland to mount a devastating counterattack. The armoured fist that might have thrown the Allies back into the sea was paralysed by indecision, waiting for orders that would come too late. Worse still, Hitler had convinced himself the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest distance between England and France. It was logical, it was obvious, it was exactly what Allied deception wanted him to believe. German intelligence, hollowed out by Allied counterintelligence operations, fed him confirming reports. Entire divisions sat idle at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The psychological toll on German commanders was profound. They knew the invasion was coming, but not when or where. Every sunrise brought the possibility of armadas on the horizon. Soldiers who had fought across Europe, hardened veterans of brutal Eastern Front winters, found themselves manning concrete boxes, staring at empty seas, wondering if today would be the day. Rommel worked frantically to strengthen defences, planting millions of mines and obstacles. But time was against him. Weather delayed work. Resources were stretched thin, and deep down, he understood a terrible truth. They were preparing for a battle they had already lost in the conference rooms of Berlin, where strategic paralysis had replaced decisive leadership. Across the Channel, Allied planners watched, waited, and prepared to exploit every mistake. The question was no longer if the wall would break, but how many lives it would cost to break it. In a heavily guarded room in London, military planners surrounded a massive table covered with maps, aerial photographs, and intelligence reports. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. One officer stabbed his finger at a section of French coastline and asked the question that would determine the fate of millions. Where do we land? Every eye in the room knew what hung in the balance. Choose wrong, and the invasion becomes another Dieppe, a slaughter that could delay victory for years, perhaps forever. The obvious choice was Pas-de-Calais. The narrow channel crossing meant shorter supply lines, more air cover, and the quickest route to the German heartland. It was so obvious that the Germans had fortified it into a steel trap. Intelligence reports showed concentrated divisions, overlapping fields of fire, and Rommel's most experienced troops waiting precisely there. Then someone proposed Normandy. The room erupted in debate. Normandy meant longer sea crossings, exposing thousands of troops to German submarines and air attack. It meant landing on beaches backed by high cliffs and flooded marshlands that could trap advancing forces. But it also meant surprise, and in warfare, surprise purchases time with blood. The decision was made. Normandy would be the target, but landing there was only half the problem. The other half was making the Germans believe the invasion was coming anywhere else. Allied intelligence launched the most elaborate deception operation in military history, Operation Fortitude. They created an entire phantom army, the first United States Army group, complete with fake radio traffic, dummy tanks made of rubber and wood, and fabricated supply depots visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. Leading this ghost army was General George Patton, whose reputation terrified German commanders. If Patton was in England opposite Calais, the reasoning went, well, that's where the invasion must be. The deception worked beyond anyone's expectations. German intelligence intercepted fake radio messages, photographed inflatable tanks, and reported troop movements that existed only on paper. Hitler became convinced that Normandy, if attacked at all, would be a diversion, with the real invasion coming at Calais. Meanwhile, the French resistance risked everything to provide intelligence. They counted German divisions, photographed coastal defenses, and died in Gestapo interrogation rooms rather than reveal what they knew. Their reports, smuggled across the channel in hollowed-out vegetables and coded messages broadcast on BBC radio, gave Allied planners precise details of German positions. Aerial reconnaissance flew thousands of missions, cameras capturing every bunker, every gun emplacement, every potential obstacle. Photo analysts worked 18-hour shifts, marking targets and identifying weaknesses in German defenses. They noticed patterns, gaps in the Atlantic wall, sections where fortifications remained incomplete, beaches where the gradient would allow tanks to advance. The psychological weight on Allied commanders intensified daily. Eisenhower carried the knowledge that his decisions would determine who lived and who died. Planners calculated acceptable casualty rates, cold mathematics that translated to mothers receiving telegrams and fathers burying sons. Some estimates predicted 90% casualties on certain beaches, but there was no turning back. Stalin demanded action. The war demanded sacrifice. And thousands of young men were already boarding ships, most unaware they were part of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The plan was set. The troops were ready. The deception was working. Now they needed only one thing: the right weather to cross the channel. But weather, like war, answers to no commander. June 5th, 1944. General Eisenhower stood before a window, watching rain lash against the glass. Meteorologists had delivered devastating news. A storm system was sweeping across the channel. Postponing meant keeping thousands of men sealed in ships, seasick and terrified, for days or weeks. But launching into a storm meant drowning men before they ever reached the beach. At 4:15 a.m., Eisenhower made the decision that would define history. Okay, we'll go. Hours later, in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled began moving toward Normandy. Over 5,000 ships carried 156,000 troops across water that churned with residual storm swells. In the holds, men vomited from seasickness and fear. Some wrote final letters, others prayed. A few slept, exhausted beyond anxiety. Above them, 11,000 aircraft filled the skies, bombers targeting coastal defenses, fighters sweeping for German interceptors, and transport planes carrying paratroopers who would drop behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings. The psychological burden on these paratroopers was crushing. They were jumping into darkness, into occupied territory, with no certainty of where they would land or if their units would survive long enough to regroup. At Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division experienced something almost miraculous. Strong currents pushed their landing craft a mile south of the intended target, directly into a section with lighter defenses. Within hours, they had moved inland with relatively minimal casualties. Fortune, for once, had smiled. At Omaha Beach, hell opened its gates. The pre-invasion bombing had missed its targets, leaving German fortifications intact. As landing ramps dropped, machine gun fire tore through the first waves of soldiers before they could take 10 steps. Bodies floated in surf turned red. Men carrying 70 pounds of equipment drowned in water barely 6 feet deep. Those who reached the beach found themselves pinned against a seawall, unable to advance, unable to retreat, watching friends die beside them. Private Robert from Iowa, the soldier clutching his mother's photograph, made it 30 yards before shrapnel ripped through his leg. He crawled behind a steel obstacle, tourniqueted his own wound, and watched officers die, trying to rally troops forward. The beach was chaos, burning vehicles, screaming wounded, and the incessant hammer of German guns firing from positions that seemed invulnerable. For 6 hours, Omaha Beach hung in balance. The invasion could have failed there, could have become the catastrophe Churchill had feared. But small groups of men, led by sergeants and lieutenants whose names history would never record, began moving. They found gaps in the wire. They climbed the bluffs under fire. They silenced German positions one bunker at a time, paying for each meter of ground with blood. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces faced fierce resistance but achieved their objectives. Specialized tanks cleared obstacles. Naval gunfire suppressed German positions. By afternoon, they were pushing inland, linking up with paratroopers who had been fighting isolated battles since midnight. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had established a foothold in Fortress Europe. It wasn't the clean breakthrough planners had hoped for. Casualties exceeded 10,000 with thousands dead. But they had done what many thought impossible. They had breached the Atlantic Wall. Yet the battle for Normandy had only begun. The hardest fighting still lay ahead. In a German bunker overlooking Omaha Beach, a 19-year-old machine gunner named Klaus sat among empty shell casings, his hands still shaking. For 6 hours, he had fired until the barrel glowed red, watching men fall in waves. Now, as Allied soldiers finally overran his position, he surrendered with relief, glad the killing was over, glad he had survived. But for thousands of others on both sides, the killing had only begun. The first 24 hours after D-Day revealed a disturbing truth. The Allies had landed, but they couldn't advance. German resistance, rather than collapsing, was stiffening. Every hedgerow, every village, every farmhouse became a fortress. The bocage terrain of Normandy, ancient fields divided by thick earthen walls and dense vegetation, transformed into a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. At Omaha Beach, even after the initial breakthrough, soldiers faced withering fire from positions the pre-invasion bombardment had missed entirely. German artillery, positioned inland and protected by concrete, rained shells on the beaches where supplies and reinforcements were piling up. Medical tents overflowed with wounded. Body collection teams worked through the night. The psychological toll was staggering. Men who had survived the landing now faced the realization that yesterday's horror was merely the beginning. Shell shock cases multiplied. Some soldiers, their minds fractured by the violence, simply stopped functioning, staring blankly while battles raged around them. The absence of coordinated German response was both blessing and curse for the Allies. Field Marshal Rommel, the one commander who might have organized an effective counterattack, was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday when the invasion began. He raced back, but precious hours had been lost. Hitler, convinced Normandy was a feint, refused to release panzer divisions from Calais. By the time he realized his error, Allied air superiority had made daytime movement suicidal for German armor. But individual German units fought with desperate ferocity. SS divisions, Nazi ideologues trained to never surrender, launched counterattacks that pushed Allied forces back toward the beaches. At Carentan, American paratroopers fought house-to-house battles against defenders who knew that retreat meant execution. The town changed hands 3 times in as many days. Weather became an enemy as brutal as any German division. The storm that Eisenhower had gambled against returned with vengeance on June 19th. For 4 days, gales battered the Normandy coast, destroying one of the artificial harbors the Allies had towed across the Channel, an engineering marvel called Mulberry Harbor that had taken months to construct. Without it, supply lines strangled. Tanks sat idle for lack of fuel. Artillery fell silent for lack of shells. The wounded died for lack of medical supplies. German commanders, sensing Allied vulnerability, pressed their advantage. They understood that if they could bottle up the invasion force long enough, prevent the breakout from the beachhead, they might still throw the Allies back into the sea. Every day the Allies remained trapped was another day to bring up reinforcements, another day to fortify defensive positions. The Allied soldiers, exhausted and traumatized, began to wonder if they had traded one nightmare for another, escaping the beaches only to die slowly in the hedgerows of France. Meanwhile, strategic cities like Caen and Cherbourg remained in German hands, their capture essential for any hope of breakthrough. The question haunting Allied command was brutal in its simplicity. How many more lives would liberation cost? 3 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces remained trapped in a coastal pocket barely 10 miles deep. What was supposed to be a rapid breakout had become a grinding war of attrition. In the hedgerows of Normandy, soldiers discovered that liberating Europe would be measured not in swift advances, but in meters gained at the cost of lives. The city of Caen became an obsession for British Commander General Bernard Montgomery. He had promised to capture it on D-Day itself. Instead, German forces transformed it into a fortress. Every stone building became a sniper position. Every street was pre-registered for artillery fire. British and Canadian troops attacked repeatedly, only to be thrown back by counterattacks from SS Panzer divisions that fought with fanatical determination. The psychological impact on Allied troops was devastating. Veterans of North Africa and Italy, men who thought they had seen the worst of war, were shocked by the intensity of fighting in Normandy. A soldier could survive D-Day only to die weeks later, killed by a sniper hidden in a hedgerow or shredded by artillery he never heard coming. The randomness of death wore on everyone. Some men developed a fatalistic calm, others broke entirely. Cherbourg, a critical port city, fell on June 27th after brutal street fighting. But the victory was hollow. German engineers had demolished the harbour so thoroughly that it would take weeks to make it operational. The Allies had captured ruins, not a functioning port. Supply problems intensified. Ammunition was rationed. Replacements for casualties arrived slowly, leaving units undermanned and exhausted. The battle for Caen exposed another disturbing reality. Allied armour was outmatched. American Sherman tanks, mass-produced and reliable, faced German Tigers and Panthers that could destroy them at ranges where the Shermans couldn't fight back. Tank crews called themselves Ronson lighters, a grim joke referencing a cigarette lighter advertisement. Lights first time, every time. German anti-tank guns positioned in hedgerows became execution squads. Sherman after Sherman erupted in flames, crews burning alive or scrambling out only to be cut down by machine gun fire. British crews fared no better. A single German Tiger could anchor an entire defensive position, its 88mm gun destroying anything that approached. Allied tankers developed dark humor and darker fatalism. They knew their machines were mobile coffins, but they climbed inside anyway because the infantry needed them. Yet slowly, the balance was shifting. Allied air superiority became suffocating. German reinforcements moving toward Normandy were hammered day and night by fighter bombers. Roads became graveyards of destroyed vehicles. German commanders could only move at night, and even darkness offered no sanctuary. Allied aircraft dropped flares that turned night into deadly day. The French resistance intensified operations, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing German supply columns. Their courage was matched only by the brutality of German reprisals. Entire villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were burned. Civilians were executed as warnings. The resistance fought anyway, knowing that every German soldier delayed by sabotage was one fewer soldier at the front. Inside Caen, civilians huddled in cellars and medieval crypts as the city was pulverized. Allied bombing, intended to break German resistance, instead created more rubble for defenders to hide in. When British forces finally entered the ruins in early July, they found a moonscape of destruction where a city had stood. The capture of Caen marked a turning point, not because it was strategically decisive, but because it broke the stalemate's psychological grip. The Allies were finally ready to attempt what everyone had been waiting for, Operation Cobra, the breakout that would decide the campaign's fate, July 25th of 1944. American troops crouched in foxholes south of St. Lo, watching the sky darken with aircraft. Over 1,500 bombers were about to unleash hell on a 5-mile strip of German defenses. Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive, was beginning. Some soldiers cheered, others, veterans who had seen what came after bombardments, simply checked their ammunition and waited. The earth erupted. For nearly an hour, bombs turned German positions into a landscape from nightmares. Craters 20 feet deep, trees stripped to splinters, defenders buried alive or driven mad by the concussive force. When American infantry advanced, they found German soldiers wandering in shock, bleeding from ears and noses, unable to fight, unable to even comprehend what had happened. but Cobra nearly failed in its first hours. Some bombs fell short, killing American troops waiting to advance. Entire units were devastated by their own air support. General Leslie McNair, observing from the front lines, was killed instantly, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater. The psychological impact could have been catastrophic, but commanders pushed forward anyway. Too many had died to turn back now. Within 72 hours, the German defensive line shattered. American armor poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. Leading the charge was General George Patton, no longer commanding a phantom army, but real divisions hungry for action after weeks of waiting. Patton drove his forces with relentless aggression, advancing faster than supply lines could follow, capturing towns whose defenders were still expecting orders from command posts that no longer existed. The German army in France began to disintegrate. Von Rundstedt, the experienced field marshal who had argued against defending at the beaches, was dismissed by Hitler for suggesting the obvious: negotiate peace before the army is destroyed. His replacement inherited chaos. Communication networks collapsed. Units lost contact with headquarters. Entire divisions simply dissolved, soldiers surrendering or fleeing in whatever direction seemed safest. Then came July 20th, the day German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb. The plot failed, Hitler survived, and his paranoia exploded into purges. Generals who might have organized effective resistance were arrested and executed. Officers at the front, knowing they were suspected of disloyalty, hesitated to take initiative. The German command structure, already strained, became paralyzed by fear and mistrust. In Normandy, German forces trapped in the Falaise pocket faced annihilation. Allied artillery and aircraft pounded them relentlessly. Thousands died trying to escape. Thousands more surrendered. The roads became corridors of death, burning vehicles, dead horses, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of soldiers who had fought since Poland in 1939, only to die in French fields 5 years later. French civilians emerged from cellars and hiding places, staring at the devastation liberation had brought. Some wept with joy, others wept at the ruins of their homes, their villages, their lives. Liberation was not a moment of pure triumph. It was complicated, painful, purchased with destruction that would take generations to rebuild. Paris was liberated on August 25th. French forces, given the honor of entering first Image, were greeted by crowds that had endured 4 years of occupation. Church bells rang. People danced in streets. Collaborators were dragged from hiding and beaten. The joy was real, but so was the rage and the settling of scores. D-Day had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall had fallen. Nazi Germany's grip on Western Europe was broken, but the war was far from over. Ahead lay the Siegfried Line, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push into Germany itself. The soldiers who had survived Normandy would face more battles, more death, before peace finally came. Yet on the beaches where it all began, where thousands had died in the first terrible hours, one truth was undeniable. June 6, 1944, had changed everything. The liberation of Europe had begun, and nothing could stop it now.